to recap where we've been the last couple of days, Matthew 21 through 23, we have a very bombastic arrival to Jerusalem by Jesus, full of fanfare, drawing as much attention to himself as he possibly can to try to win over the crowds, to try to help them to realize they have a choice to make between the powers that be and the new way that he is bringing through his own life and through his own ministry and eventually through his own death. And of course, we come to the end of the struggle, the battle between him and the religious leaders, and Jesus acknowledges that the people are not ready, and he walks away rejected. Then, on his way out, he says, I'm leaving, to his disciples, and they're freaked out. They're like, why are you leaving? What's going to happen? And then he says, not only am I leaving, but the temple is going to be destroyed before I come back. And so the disciples want information. And so Jesus takes 2 chapters while he's kind of leaving, licking his wounds from these couple of days of battle and struggle with the religious leaders by heading out to the Mount of Olives and then talking to his disciples about how this is all going to wrap up, the trouble and tribulation that Israel is going to face before his return eventually to inaugurate his Father's kingdom, and all the problems and how they'll recognize it and so on. But of course, it's important to him not just that they be prepared with information about the future, but that they also know how he wants them to live in the present in light of the future. So really, most of the information he shares with them is not end-time events the way that we maybe have been trained to expect them when we read these passages, as much as it is him saying, look, you need to live a certain way now in light of the fact that I'm coming back to set up my Father's kingdom. And so he talks about that with his disciples, and it is much more of a huddle with his people as opposed to preaching to the crowds, but he's still out in the open, he's still there for everybody to see, and he's just come off of that struggle with the battles, the powers that be. And so chapters 21 through 25 are the first 2 or 3 days of Holy Week, and they're filled with activity, filled with kind of this rush of energy. Now as we transition into Matthew 26, the mood changes dramatically. There's a huge shift starting in chapter 26 with a move from the public elements of Jesus' ministry, especially with the struggle he had with the powers, clearing out the temple, the whole triumphal entry where the crowds are screaming his name, from that very public, high-profile approach to a much more personal, intimate, and definitely private approach. From chapter 26, verse 1 on through his arrest and his trials and his crucifixion, during that time frame, it's just Jesus in rooms, locked in rooms with his closest friends and his closest disciples. And today we reach Thursday. And of course, Thursday, if you remember the timeline, Thursday is the day that Jesus gathered with his disciples to have the Last Supper and then to head off to Gethsemane, where eventually he was arrested, betrayed by Judas first, then arrested and taken into custody before his death on Friday. And here we are in this week. I don't know about you, but the first 2 or 3 days of this week, for me personally, have kind of flown by. I maybe haven't had the time or taken the time to reflect as I would have wanted to, but I think Jesus' week was like that too. And now as we get to Thursday, we really have to hit the brakes and slow way down. And what I want to do with the time that we have left is I want to take a look at several of the different scenes in Matthew 26. And I want us to slow down and look carefully at what's happening and how Jesus is processing and dealing with all of this. Because there's all the excitement of the triumphal entry, and then there's the rejection by the people. And then after the rejection, there's only promise of judgment, and then there's just the promise of the cross. That's all he has to look forward to. So the mood is very somber, it's very different, and really as we read through the first several verses, you see this growing sense of dread, this growing sense of something bad is about to happen, and Jesus is going to get caught in the teeth of this bad thing that is about to happen. As soon as Jesus has finished talking about the judgment that is to come and how God's people are supposed to take care of people in his name, and there's going to be rewards for those who do what's right and punishments for those who don't, he says this in chapter 26, verse 1. When Jesus had finished all these sayings, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming, and the Son of Man will be delivered up to be crucified." So Jesus knows. Now, we know Jesus knew this already. In fact, he's been trying to tell his disciples, probably for weeks now, that this is coming and they need to prepare for it, instead of thinking that somehow going to Jerusalem is going to lead to this kingdom coming in all of its fullness. He's like, look, guys, I hate to break it to you, but there's people in Jerusalem that hate me, and they're going to make sure that instead of me getting put on a throne as the king, that I'm going to get put on this cross as a criminal. That's happening. So Jesus knows what's coming. And so that's a sense of dark and depression a little bit, and just kind of discouragement. But then the very next thing it says in the text, verse 3, it says, then the chief priests and the elders of the people gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas, and they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar among the people. So not only has Jesus not only has Jesus said publicly to his disciples, hey buddies, this is the end, but his enemies also know that this is the end. They've decided, we're going to do this, and we're going to try not to do it when he's out in the open among the crowds. We want him to be off in private somewhere else, so they know it too. I talked on Sunday at length about the story of the woman who anoints Jesus' head with the precious ointment in Bethany. And I talked about the fact that what's remarkable about her is that she's one of Jesus' very few disciples who also seems to understand that Jesus' life is at an end. Like, she maybe actually took Jesus seriously when he said he was going to be delivered up to be crucified. Everybody else is sort of in denial. That's not going to happen. Lord, I'm not going to let that happen to you. Even if I have to die with you, I won't abandon you, blah, blah, blah. And Jesus is like, no, this is happening. And this woman, when she does this incredible demonstration of love, she's also proving, hey, I know this is the end. And so it's like the story is sliding into this really dark, sad, heavy place where Jesus knows it's coming. His enemies are planning for it to come. Even one of his disciples is starting to figure it out. And then immediately after, this woman does this amazing show of love and honor and respect to Jesus. In verse 14, it says this, Judas, one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, what will you give me if I deliver him over to you? And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment, he sought an opportunity to betray him. So Jesus knows it. His enemies know it. The woman who anointed him with ointment knows it. And Judas knows it because he's planning to help make it happen. So there's the sense in the text that there's this dread, this anticipation of what is going to happen to Jesus. Crucifixion was not no form of execution is pleasant. I understand that. But some are more painful than others. And the crucifixion was just about the most humiliating and painful way to be executed for whatever it is the government said you were guilty of. And so you see this sliding sense of discouragement and dread, and it's like it's inevitable and you can't get away from it. There's this huge cross, the shadow of a cross, hanging over the rest of the week. And so that's why the celebrations of Easter and Good Friday sometimes tend to be kind of dark and heavy and sad, is because even though we know that through the cross we had so many things good come into our lives, it's still, for Jesus, it's this horrible thing. It's this awful thing that he has to look forward to and dread, and there's a sense of inevitability to it. Now, then we come in verse 17 to today. We come to Thursday. And it's the first day of the Passover, and it's time for Jesus to celebrate the Passover with his disciples. Now, quick word about the Passover, okay? The Passover was not a somber religious ritual. It wasn't super serious and nobody laugh and everybody stay really somber and take this seriously. That's not what it was. It was a celebration. It was a joyful event. It was remembering, like, literally the most important thing that happened to the nation before they even were a nation, to set them free from slavery, right? But not only that, they were celebrating something even more specific inside of the larger picture of freedom from slavery. There was the death angel passing over all the firstborn, right? You remember the story? The 10th plague was going to be that the punishing angel was going to come through Egypt and kill the firstborn of everything, both animal and human. And so if you put some blood from a lamb on the doorposts of your house. The avenging angel would pass over your house, and your son or your daughter would live. Okay, that's the basic thing. And so when they have this Passover meal, what they're remembering is not just that they got out of Egypt, but that God was merciful to them and provided a substitute for them, for their sons, so that they could survive, so that they could come out, not just with the limping of whoever survived this judgment, but they all made it out safely. So this is like a huge happiness thing. But for Jesus, it's not. Jesus is the firstborn of his Father, is he not? The Bible calls him the firstborn of all creation. It doesn't mean that he, at one point, didn't exist and then he all of a sudden existed. It's a statement about where Jesus rates in the universe. He's the greatest of us all. He's the highest one. He's the firstborn of all of us, of the sons of God. And he enters into this thing, and the correlation between his story, the symbolism, friends, of this event is significant. Because yes, he is the Lamb of God. He becomes that Passover lamb who, when his life is taken, his blood then becomes the way for the death angel to pass over. But if you look at it from another angle, Jesus, as the firstborn of his Father, does not get to avoid the angel of death. He's going to die. And there's no way around it. And this meal that he celebrates with them, is it surprising that he takes that meal and he wants to help them understand that yes, we celebrate, but somebody has to pay the price for it, right? Like somebody has to die in order for us to live. And so he institutes this thing that we call the Lord's Supper. And it's beautiful, right? And we do it and we celebrate it as much as we can because it's so important to remember the bittersweet nature of all of this. Because it's sweet for us, because we're the people inside the house. But it's not sweet for Jesus, not at this point. Because he's the lamb who has to die so that the blood can cover us, so that the angel will pass over us. And I wonder how weird it must have been for the disciples to transition from this joyful celebration of rescue from slavery to this bittersweet remembrance that yes, we are set free, not just from the slavery to Egypt, but free from the slavery of sin. But our Savior, our friend, the guy we traveled around with, the guy we put all our hopes in, the firstborn of all creation, had to die to make that happen. So now it's bittersweet for us. And you know what's really amazing to me too is how much Jesus still cares about his friends through all of this. So right before he institutes the Lord's Supper, he says something that I've never really understood very well. He says, I tell you the truth, one of you is going to betray me. You remember that? He kind of announces it in the room. And everybody all of a sudden is, what? Are you kidding me? Somebody's going to betray you? Is it me? Is it me? And it says all of his disciples begin to be sorrowful and troubled, upset. All of a sudden, that mood that Jesus is probably feeling because of the oncoming rush of the cross in just a day, now they're starting to feel it too, because now they're implicated in this abandonment. They're like, what? Are you kidding me? Who's going to betray you? And then Judas looks and says, surely it's not me, right? We know from the text that he has literally just gone out, probably a day before, and arranged with the chief priest to betray Jesus. So Judas knows. Judas is like, Jesus points him out. And Judas goes, it's not me, is it? And Jesus says, it's you. And then it says, woe to the... Hold on, let me read it. Verse 23, Jesus answered, he who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. it would have been better for that man if he had not been born. I've often wondered, how did Jesus say those words? Did he say them in some kind of a vindictive, revengeful way? Like, if you dare cross me, you're going to wish you'd never been born. Or is he saying it in a very sad, melancholy kind of way? Here's one of his 12 closest friends who he's poured years of his life into, who he loves all of them. And one of these men is going to betray him. I wonder if this is his way of warning Judas. Judas, this is not what you want to do. Judas, the consequences of this are going to be serious for you. The reason I say that is because then the very next thing he does, as they're on their way to Gethsemane, he then tells all the disciples that they're all going to leave him. They're all going to bail on him. They're all going to abandon him and run away. And they're like, what are you talking about? No way. We're not going to do that. Peter especially is really strong about this. Even if I have to die with you, I will never abandon you. Maybe if all these guys do, but I'm never going to leave you. And Jesus says, Peter, don't you understand? By the time the rooster crows tonight, you're going to deny me 3 different times. He's warning them. Guys, you're about to enter into a test. This is going to be a huge time of temptation. You're going to realize that following me leads to a cross. And if you don't run away from me, you might join me on that cross. And a lot of you, all of you, are going to choose to run away. I think Jesus is showing interest in his friends. He's caring for them. He's loving them. He's saying, guys, it's coming. Are you ready? Are you prepared? And then they walk, right? They're walking and they're talking. And I'm sure Jesus is feeling this heavy weight. And then we come to what is perhaps, I don't want to say favorite, because that makes it seem like it's really cool. One of the most moving passages that makes me think and reflect, and honestly makes me love Jesus more than almost any other that I read in the Gospels. And that's Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think the reason that I love this passage so much is because of what it reveals to me about who Jesus is. And not only that, but what's going on inside of Jesus. So often when we read these stories, we find out what Jesus said and what Jesus did. And that's wonderful. But in this passage, we find out, what is Jesus thinking? What is Jesus feeling? And it's on display for us to see. And I want to take just the last couple of minutes here to focus in on that story of him in Gethsemane and what it is that God puts on display about Jesus. Because here's what I believe. I believe that if you really enter into what Jesus is experiencing in Gethsemane, you're going to love him. You're going to love him. You're going to be moved by what's going on inside of his heart. And you're just going to admire him. You're going to want to worship him. You're going to want to give your life for him. So let's take a look at this. It starts in verse 36. Verse 36, it's really one of the most striking portraits of Jesus in any of the Gospels, right? And it kind of lets us know what's going on in Jesus' inner world. We see him when he's very vulnerable in this passage. Look with me at verse 36, if you would. It says, "Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' And taking with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them," listen to this, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." So what do we see? We see, number one, Jesus' vulnerability on display. You know, the same guy who was so unconcerned about drowning on the Sea of Galilee that he's sleeping in the back of the boat in the middle of a crazy rainstorm, who wakes up and says, hey, calm down, and like the elements stop for him. The man who commands demons to be gone, and they run, shrieking from him. The same man who called the dead out of the grave and said, "Lazarus, come forth." And even the dead man had to wake up and obey the power in his voice. And here he is, and his vulnerability is on display. His emotions. The text uses these interesting words. It says sorrowful. That is a word for deep grief. deep grief. And then it says sorrowful and troubled. You see that word troubled? I looked this word up, really, really interesting. It means literally grief all around. Grief all around. The idea is that he was surrounded by sadness to the point where it's like the idea of it almost jumping up on him and pulling him down and overwhelming him. Have you ever felt troubled? Have you ever felt surrounded by grief? Have you ever felt like there was grief everywhere you look? You look over here, there's grief. Over there, there's grief. That is exactly how Jesus is feeling. And one of the commentaries or one of the study books I looked up said this is the word that is most frequently used for what we call depression today. And I don't know how you feel about the idea of Jesus feeling depressed. But at the very least, even if you don't want to use that word, maybe that's a little too psychobabble for you. At the very least, the text says he was very sorrowful and incredibly troubled, surrounded and weighed down with grief. And he says, I feel so sad. I'm so sorrowful. I'm so churned inside my spirit. He felt like he was going to die just from the emotions of it all. I'm telling you, his vulnerability is on display in this passage unlike any other that I've ever read. Even his temptation in the wilderness with the devil, he was much more put together than this. But here's the second thing that I see, and I want to talk about this for just a couple of minutes because I think it's really important. Not only was Jesus' vulnerability on display, but Jesus' training was on display. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that he enters into this test, and trust me, Gethsemane was probably the greatest test he ever faced in his life as a man on earth. That 33 years. This is it. The cross itself is not nearly the test that Gethsemane is to him. But he entered into this test ready for the test. You might say, and I've tried to say this in other messages, he has been preparing for this test his entire life, and we see evidence of that training. Number one, we find out in this text, everybody, it's late at night, it's after your meal, everybody is ready to sleep. Even if it's under the stars, they're ready to go to sleep. And all the disciples fall asleep in the garden except for one guy. Who's that one guy? Jesus. Why? Because he knows it's a bad idea to fall asleep when you're walking into the enemy territory. When you're walking into a temptation, when everybody else wants to just take it easy and go to sleep, people who have training say, no, I need to stay awake. But not only did he stay awake when everybody else was falling asleep, but number two, he's also asking for help from his friends. Did you pick up on that? He pulled Peter, James, and John, his three closest guys, and he said, guys, I need you to stay up and watch with me. I need you to pray with me and for me. In other words, he felt like I'm going through this huge test, and I need some of my guys to have my back, to protect me, to pray for me, to add additional strength to me so that I can get through this. He wouldn't have known how to do that if he hadn't trained to do that for 3 years with these guys. And here he's calling them to back him up. And what do? They fail him horribly. But even then, even though he knew they were going to fail him, he still invited them into his pain. I think that's a lesson for all of us as we go through difficult times and tests and trials. Not only that, what does he pray to the Father about? Verse 39. Going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, my Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Do you know what his training had taught him? To ask God for what you want. Ask God for relief. He doesn't try to be hyper spiritual and say something that he's not feeling. In that moment, what he wanted was to escape the suffering, to escape the cross, to not have to deal with it anymore. And so his training is coming through because he knows in prayer, if you want prayer to work, you got to be real with God. You got to ask him for what you really want. You got to ask him for what's really on your heart. You can't go into prayer and try to play games with God and try to convince him that you're more spiritual than you are. Come to him as you are. Ask for what you want. That is part of this whole thing. When you're battling with temptation, ask for what you want. God, ask for relief. Do it. Jesus did. But then the next part of it shows his training even more. Not only did he beg God for relief, but then, number 4, he accepted God's answer, whatever it was. Look what he says here. If it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. He's trained himself to trust over the course of his whole life that the Father has a plan for him, and that even though that plan involves incredible pain, unequaled pain, suffering like none of us have ever or will ever experience, even though that's true, that the Father's plan is good. Why? Because the Father's heart is good and God can be trusted. And Jesus has been training his heart for 33 years to get to this moment when he's willing to say, Father, I don't care what you answer. I'm good with whatever you answer. If you want to give me relief from this and find another way to do it that doesn't involve a cross, I'm all in. Let's do that. But if not, I'm still all in. I'm still here. I'm still yours. I'm still yours to command. Tell me where to go, Father. I'm ready to take my place. See, that's training. That takes time. And I love this story because Jesus is battling. He's battling his own emotions. And he's saying, you know what? I want this so badly. But what I want more is to please my heavenly Father. And so, God, I'm going to accept any answer you give me. That doesn't come, friends, without training. It doesn't come without practice. And then my last thing, I love this. His training shows in that he didn't quit when the relief didn't come right away. You know what I mean? Here's what I mean. It says he prayed that one time. He goes to find the guys. They're asleep. He rebukes them, says, wake up. He goes back a second time, prays the same thing. Now, why did he pray the same thing? Is it because God didn't hear him the first time? No, it's because his heart was still churned up. He was still sorrowful and troubled and feeling like he was going to die from all the weight that was surrounding all around him. That's what he thought was going to happen. So he went back and prayed a second time because the battle wasn't over yet. That just because he prayed once didn't mean the battle was over. See, that takes training to realize. It takes training to realize that when you're fighting depression, when you're fighting sadness, when you're fighting grief, one prayer time is probably not going to be enough to fix your heart, to heal it. You got to keep going. You got to keep fighting. And Jesus is showing us here. Don't give up if you pray one time and it doesn't all of a sudden feel better. Keep at it. Keep at it. He does it 3 times. The Son of God goes back and prays the same prayer 3 times. Not because God is deaf, not because God has trouble hearing, but simply because Jesus had trained himself to stay in the battle till the battle was won. And then what I love is at the very end, once he's prayed his 3 times, something happened. There was a transformation that happened in him. And what you see thirdly is Jesus' courage on display. So first you have his vulnerability on display, then his training on display, then his courage. Look at verse 45. Verse 45 says this, "Then he came to the disciples and said to them, 'Sleep and take your rest later on. See, the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand.'" He's like, game on. Let's do this. Let's go for it. He is no longer terrified. He's no longer trembling with fear. He has decided. He's made up his mind. God has strengthened him for this test, and he is ready to go. And I'll be honest, I love that about Jesus. I look at this whole scene, and I'm just captivated by him. He wins me over every time. Because nobody else could be that vulnerable. Nobody else had ever trained that hard. Nobody else could be that courageous and brave. But he was. Because he was, you and I get to be free. You and I get to have the avenging angel pass over our houses. Because he was faithful. And he made it through his test. He made it through his struggle. So as you reflect today, reflect on Jesus, who passed his test with flying colors so that he could save you. Reflect on that today. Meditate on that today. And may that lead you into tomorrow when we get together again at 4 o'clock for another meditation. Don't forget, if you would like to contribute to our Samaritan's Purse gift, we would love, love, love for you to have the opportunity to do that. Please just donate online or send us a check. We want to try to help the field hospital that's happening in New York City. And also, if you would like to help sew masks to benefit the hospitals around here, we have kits that we've put together or that people in the church have put together and instructions for how to make them. Our hospitals are asking for our help. If you would like to come and grab one of these kits, all you got to do is make an appointment, stop by to pick them up. We'll be here tomorrow, and we would be glad to put one of these in your hands, and you can help our beleaguered health care staff to make sure they have the best protection possible from this coronavirus thing. May the Lord bless you as you reflect on Christ, as you remember him in the garden, praying his heart out, fighting and struggling for you. He passed his test. May we be faithful to pass ours as well.